December 8, 1965, soldiers lined St Andrews Road for the arrival of the head of state. It was the opening of Singapore's first parliament. It was only 2 years before that Singapore joined Malaysia, but the hopes and aspirations which had accompanied the island's entry into the Federation were short-lived. The attempt at merger had failed. The central government at Kuala Lumpur and the Singapore government had profound differences in their political beliefs. In the end, the only alternative, in order to avoid political and racial strife, was for Singapore to leave the Federation. And on the morning of December the 8th, PAP assemblymen and cabinet ministers made their way to Assembly House to map out a new future for an independent Singapore. Separation from Malaysia also meant that legislative assemblymen who were elected in the 1963 general elections had become Singapore's first members of parliament. Likewise, Assembly House came to be called Parliament House. Sharply at 10 a.m., the motorcade of the Yang di-Pertuan Negara arrived at the gates of Parliament House. At 54, Encik Yusof bin Ishak had been Singapore's first local-born head of state since the island was granted self-government in 1959. In the House, the fully occupied gallery and the seats taken up by PAP MPs stood out in sharp contrast with the silent and empty benches of the opposition. Members of the Barisan Sosialis had boycotted Parliament. Their chairman, Dr. Lee Siew Choh, had branded Singapore's independence as phony and had proclaimed that his party would not give legal cover to Parliament by being part of it. The Barisan Sosialis was then the sole opposition in Parliament. Their boycott was a fatal mistake, as it effectively excluded them from parliamentary politics, and this had led to a weakening of their party, as well as to the PAP's political dominance in Singapore. It was a one-party parliament, therefore, that greeted the Yang di-Pertuan Negara as he entered the House for his opening address.
Can take heart at the thought that there are a few new problems to bedevil this House. This House has gone through many a struggle, first against colonialism, then communism, and then communalism. And there have always been opportunists to cloud and confuse.
In his speech, Encik Yusof bin Ishak outlined the government's plans for the coming years and warned of the dangers that Singapore would face. It was a message with survival of the new state as the underlying theme. Touching on the dangers posed by communalism and communism, Encik Yusof reaffirmed the government's commitment to the building of a tolerant, multiracial state. Then as now, economic survival was a priority on the agenda. That meant trading with as many countries as possible, as Singapore could no longer rely on a common market with Malaysia, as had been envisaged during the period of merger. In areas of foreign policy and security, the Yang di-Pertuan Negara had this to say.
Our security depends upon having the minimum number of unfriendly countries and the maximum number of friendly ones. We want the least number of countries to be hostile to us, if for no reason other than we wish to be as independent of foreign defense assistance as possible. But now
in all, the President's speech reflected the desire to make an independent Singapore viable, and it was the responsibility of the first Parliament to undertake many of the goals outlined in that address.
In Africa and Eastern Europe.
Two important bills passed were the Constitutional Amendment Bill and the Independence of the Republic Bill. These saw to the constitutional transition of Singapore as a state within the Federation to that of an independent country. It also changed the title of the Yang di-Pertuan Negara to that of President of the Republic. Encik Yusof bin Ishak thus became Singapore's first president. Singapore's Minister for Defence, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, introduced the Army Bill, which was passed on the 24th of December 1965. The aim of this bill was to set up a well-trained regular army supported by a large people's volunteer force. Dr. Goh argued that Singaporeans should not be complacent about defence just because they were still under British military protection. No one could be sure, he said, when the British bases would be withdrawn from Singapore. The passing of the Army Bill saw the establishment of a People's Defence Force. Many MPs, like Mr. Jack Yun Tong, who was the Minister for Labour, and Encik Osman Wok, volunteered their services to set an example for their fellow citizens. The Army Bill was important because it prepared the people for the introduction of compulsory national service 2 years later in 1967.
There will be productive employment.
Our economy will probably do...
Many changes have taken place since the opening of the first Parliament.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, sir, I shall be very brief.
In 1984, for the first time in 23 years, 2 opposition members were voted into the House, and the parliamentary debates and proceedings were brought into the living rooms of Singaporeans a year later in 1985. To a large extent, the steps taken by successive parliaments since the first sitting in 1965 has contributed significantly to the evolution of Singapore into a modern and thriving city-state with a standard of living that is the highest in the region. And this progress, in many ways, echoes the President's closing words to the first Parliament. An industrious and talented people striving to secure their future will surge forward to prosperity and strength if they are given honest administration and effective leadership.